You ready to go? Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to coming to class. And this is my introduction of someone who does not need an introduction. You came to hear from him, not about him. So today is the first of 4 Sundays on origins and segments of American religious landscape in terms of backgrounds and ideals. And I hope that everybody got their homework sheet and answer sheet. There's blank spaces on the homework sheet. And I failed miserably. But anyways, John, thank you.
Thank you, man. Van's my downstairs neighbor. Man, I swear those are leisure pants, not my pajamas. I come down and get observed. Listen, thank you all for being here. As you know, we're bifocal. I look at that camera back there. There I am, right there. You don't look there. I'm there. And some people out there in radio land may not know what we're doing, but we're getting caught up on this anyway. I've given you 2 handouts. Excuse me. First handout is the kind of introductory sheet. There's a 1-paragraph description with a couple of typos in it of what the course is going to be about. And then I've given you a kind of a template, which is general format, each of our lessons together. The 5 points in each lesson will go down the same. The content will be quite different, but the same pattern will hold for all of them, so you might get used to it before we're done. Then at the bottom, there is the opportunity for you to choose 3 people who are founders of religious groups in America, and you can fill in the blanks there, or you can save it. Don't save it till the last Sunday and bring it in and hand it in. That will do. But fill it out. Just see who you think we may be talking about for the next 3 weeks. I've given you 2 hints already. Number 1, no Joseph Smith. A couple of reasons for that. Although, in all odds, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, is probably one of the most successful of these quote-unquote new religions which broke out on the American scene in terms of number of adherents, in terms of permanence, all those things. But the other reason for that is complicated. The other reason is Ann Will gave us 4 lessons on that about 3 years ago, and I don't want to go over the same territory. So think back to 3-4 years ago in this class, and you'll know what the Mormons are all about. So that's number 1. Number 2, the hint I gave you is today our topic is Mother Ann Lee, kind of the founder figure of the group that we know of as the Shakers. The formal name for that is the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. But you never see that too much. They call them Shakers. So today we're going to be talking about the Shakers. Next week, guess what? You don't know yet, but it's real good. That doesn't mean I haven't picked it out already. It really have. Stay tuned. Now, just a couple of words, 3 words really, a prologue before we go any further. First word has to do, if I can reach into my pocket and find it without wrecking this thing. I can't find it. I had a $1 bill in my pocket. Missy? There you go. On the back of the $1 bill, I've told some places this before, I don't know if you know it or not. On the back of the $1 bill, there's a pyramid with all-seeing eye on top. Some people think of that as kind of a Masonic symbol. We don't really know the real origin of it. But underneath it, there are these 3 words: Novus Ordo Seclorum. New order of the world, new order of the secular. And the point in all that is to say on our $1 bill, it's been there for a long time, that we're starting something new in this country. That we have here a brand new effort to do something different that's really probably never been done before when this nation was founded. That's point 1. Point 2 takes you back to 1648. After a series of wars that absolutely wrecked the European society. It was called the 30 Years' War, and it might near last 30 years. Wars all over Europe, all the nations being involved in it. Some people estimate as many as a 4th or a 5th of the whole population were annihilated in that war. And this is not a nuclear war or anything like that, but it was very, very vicious. 1648, the participants in that war, or most of them, came together at Westphalia, and they formed a treaty to talk about how the territory of Europe was going to be divided up, and also, this was the important thing, to find out how the religions on the European continent were going to be divided up. Because one of the main causes of those wars was the fact that there had been a Protestant Reformation, and that there had been a kind of a fracturing of the body politic of Christendom at that point. Roman Catholic Church had been almost the only show in town for a long time. Martin Luther comes along, 1517. Then John Calvin a little bit later in that century, and Europe gets fragmented by these new religious ideas. So that at Westphalia, when they came together, they divided it all up, and they said, "You are a Catholic country, you are a Lutheran country, you are," and there weren't many of these, "but you are a Reformed country." And those three factors, the Catholics, the Lutherans, and the Reformed, or the Calvinist group, really controlled most of the territorial land in the whole of the continent of Europe from there on for a little while longer. Now there was a wild card on the outside, as you probably well know, and that wild card was England, was the British Isles. And under the leadership of Henry VIII, the British Isles declared their own independence from Rome and established a state church, which we think of as the Anglican Church. But that was not included in this because they were not on the continent of Europe. So you've got these people who have a stake, an invested interest in what is going on in their particular territory. There's a Latin term that was used for that, and it was cuius regio eius religio. What that meant is whoever the ruler is, that's what the religion is going to be. You call the shots in your own nation. So that's what Europe looked like at about the time that the New World was opening up to discovery. That's point number two. Point number three is, when the New World opened up the settlement, it was fair field and no favors. Now we think about the fact that the English came to Plymouth Rock, Jamestown, settled the eastern seaboard of what we now know as the United States. That's one little piece of it. The French came into the north, Roman Catholics. The Spaniards came into the south, an entirely different sort of Roman Catholicism, but the same general movement. And then, on top of that, you have the Germans, you have the Swedes, you have the Dutch, you have almost every nation in Europe which had any kind of colonial pretensions coming into the New World and trying to get a grub stake on this continent. So what you have here is a kind, I say it's going to be a tapestry. Really what it's going to be more like is a patchwork quilt of different sorts of religion existing side by side. If you look at the original 13 American colonies, you see about 7 or 8 of them which are declared to be, quote, Anglican, Church of England. But if you look underneath the surface, some of them are not Anglican at all. Now Virginia is, but some of the rest of them are whatever's there. The Baptists, the Presbyterians, a lot of different people are gaining control in these places. So it really is a patchwork quilt. That's the way the nation gets started, with religious pluralism for sure, and at least a certain degree of religious diversity as well. Okay, so much for the prologue. Now, let's get to the topic for the day, which is a founder figure whose name is Anne Lee. For a while in her life, she was Anne Lee Stanley or Anne Lee Standering, because she was married to a blacksmith who was so insignificant in the whole story of things that we don't really know what his last name was. But she didn't keep it for long. Anyway, this is Mother Anne Lee's religion. She is the founder figure. Now, first of all, what is she founding? Well, the best way to find that, and I'm on paragraph 1 now, to people on TV. I'm on paragraph 1 now, and this has to do with the ideal. And the ideal is a very simple one. What Anne Lee intended to do was establish heaven on earth. She was about the business of establishing what Thomas More, during the reign of Henry VIII, called a utopia. However, as we all know, that word utopia means no place. However, the term that we use, it means a kind of a perfect society, and in this instance, a perfect society which is modeled upon the kingdom of God. So, that's what the goal is. And I've listed 5 points here. I thought it was very clever because those 2 things can run together, all those 5 things can run together to form one somewhat awkward sentence. So let's go to the first part. The ideal is to establish a community for believers only. And those believers have distinctive beliefs which set them apart from the rank and file of the rest of the people around them. And those distinctive beliefs yield a particular lifestyle, which is different, but in most instances it has to be more or less acceptable, at least tolerable, by the larger society, and they just snuff it out. So, believers only with distinctive beliefs, a particular lifestyle in an exclusive community, which means believers only, but outsiders need not apply. Now, as you go through a story of a community like this, you see that there are variations in how open and how reserved they are. In some instances, they are utopian. We are building this so that everybody will see it and will join in the kinds of ideas that we have, and we'll have a heaven on earth all over the earth. The other extreme of that is what we call introversionist. Heck, nice word. Introversionist, and that means they close in upon themselves. They circle up the wagons. They try to keep their community for their community. Outsiders need not apply. So, an exclusive community, more or less, sometimes exclusive only because of physical distance and kind of social distance as well. Sometimes they're just exclusive because they declare themselves to be the only ones who belong in the kingdom when all is said and done. Now, the final bullet point there has to do with the thing which really sets them apart in a very distinctive way as we look at the world around, and that is they have decided to hold all things common. In the book of Acts, in the 2nd chapter, the 44th verse, again in the book of Acts, the 4th chapter, the 32nd verse, we're told that the original church, the church of the disciples in Jerusalem, determined to hold all things common, which means whatever you have is mine, whatever I have is yours. We pool our resources and thereby we can live together. Now, oftentimes when this happens, it's a matter of necessity. Nobody has anything, so we try to make it on what we've got. Other times, it's a very determined sense of trying to establish an equalitarian society in which nobody has more than anybody else. And a community like the one we're talking about today, anybody who came in who had property simply gave over that property to the larger community. They're pretty shrewd founders. They said one thing, we don't take any property that's got a loan out on it. But anybody who has anything, you put it all together. And that's what we're looking at when we look at this sort of intentional community. Certainly this is what Ann Lee had in mind when she led the way to establish a community. Now that's point number one. If I can get point number two, turn the page here. The setting. This is important. Anything we talk about, what's going on in the outside world, and thereby, as far as it echoes the outside world, what's going on in the establishment of some religious entity, a new religious entity. First of all, Ann Lee, we'll get back to this in a little greater detail in a minute, but Ann Lee and 8 of her followers arrived in New York in 1774. Does that number ring a bell? Anybody? There's a revolution brewing in this country. It was said that Ann Lee might have been somewhat oblivious to the fact when she brought her followers. But Ann Lee came to this country in revolutionary times. And revolutionary times are typically represented by some measure of disassociation, dislocation, disarray. So she came into a country which was a country in turmoil. She also came into a country which had been infused, some would say infected, infused with ideas that came out of the European Enlightenment. And when we think about the constitutive documents of this country and the leaders of this country in those earliest days, many of them embraced a kind of a rational religion deeply influenced by the Enlightenment, which we refer to generally as deism. Deism has to do with a very logical approach to the religious dimension of life. There is a God. That God judges us for the bad things we do, rewards us for the good things we do. That God is evident to us. We can discover him, and we're supposed to follow the rules that he sets down. several other little rules there, but essentially it's a very reasonable, rationalistic approach to the supernatural. And that was a kind of a bedrock in this society about the time of the American Revolution. Oh, surely there were other people. There were Anglicans all over everywhere. There were Puritans all over New England. There were Presbyterians all over the middle colonies. There were many, many people who were more orthodox in their religious beliefs. But interestingly enough, many of the leaders, Thomas Jefferson for sure, John Adams for sure, George Washington to a lesser degree, insofar as he was interested in that sort of thing at all of those people embraced this rational approach to life in this world. So that when you look at, let's say, the Declaration of Independence, never mind what they tell you, the Declaration of Independence is not a Christian document. It is a document which is cast in a direction that was determined by thinkers like John Locke in the direction of having a rational and reasonable society. We hold these truths to be self-evident. So they were. So enlightenment is an important part of the secular in this world in which Anne Lee comes in 1774 with her 8 followers. Well, next thing to say is not only is it revolutionary, but there are uncertainties about almost every aspect of life. What is the political situation going to look like if we do, in fact, break away successfully from our masters in Europe? What is the situation going to look like in total terms of economic structure? What are we going to live on in this country if we're separated from that old world, which was our major trading partner all these years? Social uncertainty. We've had a certain hierarchical structure in society. In New England, it was believers and non-believers. In Virginia, it was landed gentry versus the peasantry almost. Everywhere we've had this social structure that you know what it is if you live there. But now, what's it going to look like in this new world? Which means that you're going to have necessarily a realignment of all the structures of community life. Which means that you don't have the government you had before. In fact, you almost eschew the government that you had before. Say, let's get something entirely different. You don't have the same economic structures that you had before. You're going to have to figure out how these 13 colonies, now states, do business with one another, because they don't have one of these, they've got 13 of those, and some of them are not worth the paper they're printed on. So you've got a different structure altogether, and you've got to figure out how to live with it. So that's the secular setting. It's a setting of dislocation, and thereby, to a certain degree, it's also a setting of openness, that it's fair field and no favors. Let's try this. Probably won't work, but let's try that. So you've got a lot of experimentation going on in this secular society. On the religious front, here's the really interesting thing of this whole story. That is, Anne Lee and her followers land on Manhattan Island and walk up Broadway as kind of an immigrant crowd between awakenings. That is to say, they had happened in the American colonies back in the 1720s, into the 1730s, almost in the 1740s. There happened this incredible explosion of religious piety and fervor, which has been called subsequently the Great Awakening. The names you know, George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, and you may remember Theodore Frelinghuysen. I remember that because he's a Dutch boy. But anyway, all these people have stirred up the population with a personal religious fervor. You have to get salvation. You cannot do without salvation. And the alternatives to this are, this is always overblown, or that spider hanging over the fires of hell in Jonathan Edwards' sermon. But you've got this call on each individual to stand and deliver for his or her own religious faith. Nobody can do it for them. Now that had happened back in the 1730s and 40s. Another one was fixing to break out just around the turn of the 19th century, just around let's say 1790, 1795, there was going to be yet another and even more pervasive awakening, which they don't have much names to call, so this is called Second Great Awakening. But these two awakenings right there in tension with each other, and Anne Lee comes in right in the middle of that. There are still echoes and embers of flame from that First Great Awakening, but nothing is happening right now of a kind of a universal nature in these colonies. Second thing, here's an interesting thing. We'll come back to this later in greater detail, but There is some perception that the changes are going to be so radical in this Novus Ordo Secularum that it's going to be absolute, the changing of the ages. It will be the millennium, the 1,000 years that are promised in the book of Revelation, in which there will be peace and prosperity for all, or maybe not. Millennialism, we'll come back to this later another week in great detail, but millennialism divides generally into two categories: the post-millennialist and the pre-millennialist. The pre-millennialists are those people that think that the 1,000 years are going to get worse and worse and worse until something has to break in and change things. So they're fairly pessimistic about the world looks like, what the world looks like. The other side of this, these post-millennialists think just on the horizon, there's going to be an era of peace and prosperity, and everybody is going to have enough under their own vine and fig tree. They're going to be living just fine. It's just out there over the horizon. Now, either one of those two approaches to the millennium can be at play at any time in American life. It seems that in many instances one pervades over the others, but both of them are there all the time. Now, there's one other one of my friends said, which is pan-millennialism. And that is, everything's going to pan out all right in the end. That's something different. So anyway, you've got millennialism, and that can be a very optimistic thing. You can be saying, look, it's really getting better and better. The whole new age is going to break open in this world. And many religious people at the time of the American Revolution were saying exactly that. But there are others who say, in just a minute now, we've got all these problems. It's going to get worse. It's going to get real worse before it gets better. So get ready for times of privation and suffering. So those two things in play all the time. Next thing on that list is disestablishment. Now, disestablishment simply means that there's no longer a state-controlled church. Disestablishment took place in the United States almost immediately after the American Revolution. Disestablishment took place in most of the colonies, which would become states, right soon after the Revolution, but some of them lasted as established religions in particular states well into the 19th century. So there are at least 3 states that lasted until I think 1818, 1831, things like that. So by and large, the idea was that no longer would the state have control over the church, period. And it's going to work out that way. The second thing is, and this is not the same thing, it's similar but not the same thing to disestablishment, that is a separation of church and state, which is to say, more or less, and sometimes less than more, the state has no business meddling in religious affairs, and the religious institutions do not have any control over the state either. Now, that's an ideal in this country, which has lasted over these 200 years, and sometimes it's been present more in the breach than in the observance. But by and large, we do have this separation of churches and states, which leads to a kind of a third leg on that stool of the difference in religion, and that is personal religious freedom. And I put sort of there because it's there, it's evident, but there's some people who are beyond the pale of that kind of religious freedom. They step over the line too far, and the state or the churches come together and conspire to kind of bridge that religious freedom. And in some instances, it's religious groups which are non-Christian, who are not allowed to hold office, allowed to vote well into the 19th century. So you have more or less personal religious freedom, at least to the point that if I live in Connecticut, let's say, I don't have to be a Congregationalist, and if I live in Virginia, I don't have to be an Anglican if I don't want to. And I really don't, according to Thomas Jefferson, I don't have to be anything if I don't want to, which is probably okay. So, personal religious freedom. And then, here, two more things I want to list here very quickly. One of them is the restructuring of religious polity. Polity is a word which comes from the same root, of course, as the polis, political, the whole thing that has to do with governing. And in this instance, religious governance that was true in the old world didn't quite hold true in this new world, because we had, as I mentioned to you before, we had this proliferation of different religious ideas existing side by side. So there emerges within American life early on just about the point of the 19th century beginning, there emerges this phenomenon called the denomination. And the denomination is neither chick nor child. It's not a sect, which breaks out like, I would say probably the Shakers at first were a sect, which breaks out apart from all other religion and stands over against them and says, you're wrong, we're right. Nor is it a church in the sense that we are dominant over this whole territory. You can't be anything else if you live in Virginia but an Anglican. Not true. So what you have here is the emergence of these competing instances of different religious traditions. Coming out of the Reformation in Europe, coming out of other places, new places, for example, and they stand together in this society, and no one of them has the leg up in terms of the running of the society. It's fair field and no favors. If you want everybody to be a Presbyterian, you better get out there and make them be a Presbyterian or a Baptist or a Methodist, because you got no claim on their lives unless they claim what you got. So you have this kind of new structure in American religious life, which was never there before. The last thing I want to mention was, because of this, and this just stands to reason, what you have here is kind of endemic pluralism of the sort you never had very many places in the world before this. These people have to live side by side. It's a pluralistic society. Now, there are probably limitations, and one of the things that we know sadly about this group that we're talking about today is it did have its limitations. People persecuted these folks because they were different. But by and large, there is this kind of diversity within society, which is a given for the rank and file of the population. Okay, number 3, we're moving on to the person itself. And this is the most interesting part of it to me. Here's a woman who was born into poverty in Manchester, England. Now, it was not the Manchester of, it was about to be the Manchester of the Industrial Revolution. There was a big population there were jobs to be had, but there was also a grinding poverty which really was incumbent upon most of the people who lived there, because urban life in England at this point, except perhaps London, it was a pretty embryonic sort of thing. People didn't know how to live together in large communities, really didn't know how to live in London that way. London fire and all that. But here in Manchester, nothing there but grinding poverty and menial jobs, and this young woman named Anne Lee is born into that circumstance. She is born into a family who probably had some connection with the Quaker religion, which, as we know, was the religion of the Spirit, which was one of the byproducts of the Puritan Reformation in 18th century in England. The Quakers were known to be peaceful people. They were known to be people who stayed apart from themselves more or less. They were persecuted some because of their strong beliefs in what, such as pacifism, that set them apart from the larger society. But there emerges in this situation a number of offshoots of these sorts of religions, and one of them we'll talk about in just a minute. Anne Lee was born into poverty. She had, most of her life, she had very menial jobs, washing dishes in the hospital. She married a blacksmith, as I've said, this man named Abraham Stanley or Standering. They had 4 children within a very short period of time, all of whom were either stillborn or nearly so, died in the early hours of its life, so that there were these 4 little babies who were born and gone. And for Anne Lee herself, this was a kind of a formative personal experience which she expanded into a matter of faith. It came to her as a kind of a revelation that if you looked at human life, the thing that was most difficult about human life was that the sexual relationship between men and women were to her the root of all evil. So she declared, and early on, she declared that if one were able to set aside carnal lust, as she called it, to set aside any kind of idea of procreation with someone of the opposite sex, you would find your way on the road to perfection. Kind of a baseline belief that she had. So, anyway, this is where she's coming from, and she falls into the company of a small group of Quakers who had become radical Quakers because they had spun out into a certain approach to religious activity, which caused them to have kind of ecstatic experiences. They were called the shaking Quakers because in their meetings they would have different kinds of spasms and different kinds of physical manifestations that they presumed was representative of the presence of God's Spirit in their life. So anyway, these shaking Quakers emerged. There was a family called Wardley, W-R-D-L-E-Y, and they adopted Ann Lee as kind of their ward, and she very soon took over the movement. In fact, she drove the Wardleys out of the movement because she was a person who was perceived by the people around her to have the gifts of being a conduit for messages from the Almighty. She was persecuted for her belief. She was thrown into prison. She was beaten up several times in the streets. And through it all, she prophesied. She kept bringing these messages, which she said were messages from God, and eventually she had gathered around herself a number of people, very small number of people, more than the 8 that came with her into the new world, but these were people who were dedicated to her as a special representative of God's presence in their lives, so that she becomes this kind of charismatic soul who is able to get other people to follow her. She left behind some of those in England when she and the 8 others got on the boat and came to the New World. They came to Manhattan. They found somewhere in Manhattan there were a couple of families that kind of took them in for the short term. A couple of the men from the group left almost immediately and went up the Hudson River, up near to what is modern day Albany, and went out into the countryside and found a piece of land which the Indians had called Niskayuna. And there in Niskayuna they began to buy a little property and began to set up a kind of basic community, and eventually Ann Lee and the others from New York, except for Abraham Standard, who just disappears altogether, but the rest of them come up the river and settle in this place just outside Albany. It's right under what is Albany Airport, but it was their first community. And Ann Lee then lived there from 1776 until 1784. She died in 1784, which means that she was in the New World a total of 10 years. But she had already planted the seeds for something that was going to be a lot bigger than she was. Now, to come to the issue of leadership and foundership, here she is, a person who has gathered around her a group of believers who are committed to her as their advocate, as their mediator between themselves and God in a very special way. So they listen to what she has to say, they come to her with their problems, she becomes really kind of a mother to them. And so she is the founder and she is the example of what she wants everybody to be. She's had these 4 stillborn children. She doesn't want to have anything else to do with human sexuality. She pulls back, she can do it. And also, having done it, she says, this is what perfection is. This is the point at which you can declare that you have no sin. So, the exemplar, the founder, she is the visionary who sees what's going to be in the future. She is the messenger from the Almighty. She speaks for God. She is, among all things, and this is a term which is both technical and popular, she is a charismatic leader. Now, the term typically means she's gifted with the gifts from God. And she is perceived by all those around her to be the one who speaks directly to God, who can communicate with God, who can bring new messages from God, and can be a mother to the whole community. And eventually, won't get into this too much, but eventually, after she's dead and gone, they begin to see her as having somehow being elevated into the celestial communion in a way that makes her the feminine principle of the whole coming of the new world, as Jesus is the masculine principle. Now, to say that she is married to Jesus, I don't think, but to say that she's right there in the top echelon of angels, archangels, and cherubim and seraphim, she's right up there next to the throne. She knows what's going on up there, and they believe that from the time that she dies. Now, one other thing is coming up in a little bit, I'll mention it in just a minute, but she not only has influence within the community during her lifetime, but there's this instance of remarkable revival within the community, which is perceived by the continuing presence of Mother Ann Lee in the midst. So she dies in 1784. She's gone, but far from forgotten within the community. So, grief at her death, but the next thing that happens is they're going to get things organized finally after she's gone. Point number 4, please. During this lifetime in the New World, in New York State, she experienced a continuation of the kind of privation and persecution which she had experienced in the Old World. She is beaten, she is imprisoned, she is at one point asleep in a bed on the second floor of a house, and they grab her by her heels and drag her down the stairs out to the front of the house. No wonder she died 10 years after she got there, because she really suffered a lot of physical persecution during the time she was here. However, during her lifetime, she began the process of trying to discover the means of building the community larger. And having come in between those two awakenings, which I mentioned to you, there is a continuing fervor in some places that will be receptive to what she has to offer. In particular, in New England, the way things shook out after the First Great Awakening was there continued to be the established church. That was the Congregational Church. There were other groups, some of them Baptists, who were different from the Congregational, only in that they wanted to baptize adults rather than infants, and they still remained within the pale. Then there was another group of those Baptists, which were called separate Baptists. They pulled apart any relationship between church and state in the colonies, and that was a bad thing to do if the Congregationalists were running the whole show. So what happens is these people are out there, sheep without a shepherd, hanging out, looking for the next thing, because they have broken with the society in a very distinctive fashion. Now they got to get somebody to come and tell them what's next. So Anne gets the message from the Almighty that she is to go on these missionary journeys into New England, leaving New York State, coming into New England, finding there in various little communities in New England very receptive people under the leadership of Baptist ministers who will also listen to her message and see what new things she has to offer. So during her lifetime, there in New England, there's established probably as many as half a dozen little communities, seed communities, which will eventually become Shaker communities on their own right. So there is this instance of converts. Eventually, in 11 places, as I think I indicated in your notes, there is the possibility of a seedbed of these new communities in New York State and over into New England in various places. But the situation here is one in which some of these may survive and some of them won't. But at the time of her death, it is clear that the message is spread simply beyond that little nuclear community she gathered around herself in this union. So, what happens next? In the thereafter, the movement moves in an entirely different but necessary direction. This happens with many of these new movements, and that is the first person, the founder figure, is going to be the visionary. He's not going to be the person who necessarily understands what the nuts and bolts ought to be. In fact, he may lead them down some roads that are going to be hard to deal with later on, but having led them there, they're going to follow along. So, for example, I use this one example, the Mormons. You got Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was a visionary. He was the one who could read through the seer stones and all that. And during his lifetime, he led them in a lot of very interesting ways, and he also caused them a passable trouble, got himself killed for it. But then comes the second man, Brigham Young. And Brigham Young is the organizer. He gets things together, he gets things done. He gets people in line with what's going to be the body and the nucleus of a new community. So, after Anne dies, comes along this man who was one of those Baptist preachers. His name was Joseph Meacham. And Joseph Meacham set about very selflessly to establish a basis on which this community could live. One of the things he did, which is very, very intriguing, especially for the time, was he established an absolute egalitarian situation with regard to gender. in the leadership of the community and in the community at large. There was never one of these communities that didn't have a male and a female person running at the same time, co-chairs. And that's the way it was going to work. Because, you see, the idea of having the sexes separate from one another was kind of baseline to community life. And so you get that kind of leadership all the way down the line. Joseph Smith established what was called the orders. And one reference I read said he determined it on the line of the structure of the temple at Jerusalem. I never had heard that before. But he has the inner circle, the leadership people who are right there at the center of everything. Then he has the second circle, which is the foot soldiers, you may say, those people who work and make the community go. And then you have a third circle of people who are seekers. They call them come-outers, who are leaving the Baptist church, leaving Congregationalism, trying to find something new in their lives. The seekers and the newly initiated people who are just coming into membership in the larger community. And he established these things in what was called families, so that you would have a family in Nishkayuna, you would have a family in Sabbath Day Lake, Maine, you would have a family way out on the frontier somewhere in Indiana or in Ohio or down in Kentucky even. All these people would be gathered together, and the structure of each of these families would look like the structure of every one of those other families. So, what you have in this early period from, let's say, 1800 to about 1850, you have an explosion of Shakerism in this country, building to as many as a couple of dozen, really about 18 were more or less permanent, of these different communities scattered where there were opportunities, kind of frontier opportunities. First of all, that New England frontier with those disaffected Baptists, and then going west with the population as it went west and establishing some very strong communities in the western part of the country, loosely connected together in this movement called Shakerism. And by the time 1850 or so, there were probably 6,000 Shakers scattered in these various communities around the country. And they were living in circumstances that were probably very comfortable. Not so wealthy. They'd given up all their property, given it over to the community at large, but they had enough to eat, they had good shelter over their heads, they had work to do. They were very much dedicated to this kind of community life. Interesting thing that happened though, almost 50 years into the establishment of this movement, in 1837, in a couple of communities on the western fringe of things, young girls began to have these perceptions of another world. They began to have visions in which they saw angels. They began, even a couple of them, say that they had messages from Mother Ann herself. And the rest of the community, this is very reminiscent to me of Salem witch trials in a way, but the rest of the community kind of latched upon what these young girls thought they were seeing, and there was this kind of mass, kind of, not hysteria, but a mass movement in the direction of listening to something from Mother herself. It was called Mother Ann's Word. And the first messages that they were getting from Mother altogether, of course, was, you're not living up to the original principle, shape up, let's get this better. And then, after about 4 or 5 years of this, it was the other thing, boy, you got this right now, keep on going, you're doing the right thing. And they were having visions, they were going off into trances and all this sort of thing, and it was perceived to be the continuing presence of Mother Ann. So it's called Mother Ann's Word. And it really kind of represented a kind of turning point of sorts in the life of this community, because at this point they began to set themselves in order with more thoroughgoing sets of rules and regulations, constitutional kind of documents and that sort of thing, drafted by the leadership in the various communities. And so they were regularizing, routinizing, we ought to say, what was fixing to happen within the whole community. And it was a means of stability. It was probably also a means of disintegration eventually. If you had a bar graph of this whole thing, you would take 1800 and you'd say, start at this point and go gradually upward, and then pretty rapidly upward to about 1850, the decade before the Civil War. And then after that, the Civil War is partly responsible for that. It began to tail off. By the time you get to 1900, although there are still Shakers alive, and there will be Shakers alive. Missy and I saw two of them in one of these communities when we went there in the 1980s, early 90s. So there are always some Shakers around after that, but the blues was off the road by the turn of the 20th century. Many of these communities were consolidating with one another or just shutting down. Sometimes they were just left derelict for people to come in and do what they would with. So what you're looking at here is a situation in which they're trying to figure out what the future is going to be. And to put it mildly, they didn't have a very optimistic business plan because they didn't have new generations being born into the community. You know, some of these communities, the Hutterites, which is an Anabaptist community, they have the largest population of children per family of any group in North America. They have about 11 children per family, and they usually work on farms. That's great. All right, if you're Shakers, what you gonna do? Well, some people are going to convert, and especially in that first half of the century, it was a very attractive alternative. People would come and people would join. Some of them what they call winter Shakers. They'd come and stay while the weather was cold, and then when things warmed up, they'd head back on the road again. But they did have some sort of accretion of the membership of adults. They also adopted a group of children, orphans primarily, or sometimes families in which the mother had died and the father could not care for the children, and the children were brought as small children and raised within the community, and most of them were expected to stay in the community for the rest of their lives. But that's a mere trickle in terms of what you need to really have one of these communities survive, because one of the things that was happening here was they were making money. They were doing things which yielded a good result in terms of finances, and they lived a very simple lifestyle. So what you gonna do with the money? Well, some of it they gave away, which was good. Some of it they invested in land and more land and more land. So they expanded around these little farms on which they lived at first. And then they had vast acreage that they couldn't manage, that they couldn't deal with, and they had to pay taxes on. So all these things were putting them into a kind of a box. And eventually this whole thing is going to collapse upon itself. And there are going to be no new members. There are going to be consolidation of communities. Back in the 1980s, there were two active communities which had 2 or 3 elderly women each. And one of them, the one in Maine, South Day Lake, they initiated some new members. The caretaker had been there and things like that. But the other community I thought we agreed we were just going to let it die out and give it to the state. So it was kind of tension there. And although there may be some people still alive who say they're Shakers, they're not a part of that original community, and they are simply there to sustain a flickering light which should have gone out by now. Now, one of the things we would have a little bit of time to talk, that is, let's talk about lasting result. This is number 5, folks on TV. First of all, really interesting historical sites. There are about 10 to a dozen sites which are still in existence. Some of them have been maintained as state historical places. Some of them have been maintained by a continuing trust. When I was teaching a course on this kind of community, I took my students, all of them, up to Kentucky, just up above Danville, Kentucky, where I guess is the southernmost really established of these communities, a place called Pleasant Hill. And the first time I saw Pleasant Hill was right after we got married. We were up there, and it was just derelict. The buildings were all empty, the windows had been blown out, knocked out. But then a foundation took it over and made it into a show place. And it's kind of a tourist venue right now, but they keep the authenticity of the thing. It's open to the public. They even have kind of hotel type rooms, boys on one side, girls on the other. But a lot of these places have been well kept, and they are really historical artifacts that ought to be seen. Another artifact that was left behind was their crafts and inventions. I found a list. I didn't want to copy it all down, but I found a list of about 2 dozen things that they had invented, including such things as a rotary harrow for plowing, I guess, and then they invented a pea sheller, and then they invented a freestanding stove, like a Franklin stove, out in the middle. They invented all these things, And interesting thing about it, they saw patents on only about 4 of these things. Because they felt that whatever they developed, they developed a lathe to make broom handles in, they developed the first flat broom, bet you didn't know that. All these things, they did these things, but they thought they were for the public. They should not have been things that they kept only to themselves and sold at a profit. So they had that kind of openness to the larger society. They did have, as I mentioned here, a literary tradition. Not only were there these written documents which established what they thought the ideals of the community ought to be, but they also had the body of material that has one way or another to do with their peculiar worshiping patterns, the so-called shaking Quakers. And some of the songs, one of them we know very well, Simple Gifts. Does it give to be simple? Does it give to be? That's one of theirs. So they had all this stuff that they pass on in that way as well. Now, really, in terms of legacy, what you see here is the beginning of a possibility for a lot of other people to do something similar. Not the same thing, but something similar. Because they demonstrated, because of this new nation and because of the expanse of territory this nation had, it was possible to establish a stable community in and of itself. And it was possible also to live in that community and have beliefs that were not nearly the same as all the other people who lived around you. And it demonstrated the fact that communitarian life in America was something that could be done, not necessarily on a religious basis, but any time a group of people have a common commitment to something and they're strongly dedicated to it with the understanding that the larger society really not going to believe what they believe, they can go off and try what they want to do. And we've had in our own time, those of us in the truth, we've had hotspots of this, 1960s and 70s, all over this country. Little groups of people with various ideas, Eastern religions, Western religion, fundamentalist Christianity, they've all established these little kinds of groups unto themselves, and they can make it go at least for a time. The Shakers had a kind of stability despite their flawed business plan. They had a kind of stability which really kind of outlets all the rest of it. It went on one way or another, it went on for well over a century. So it was an incentive to others to try to do the same thing. Well now, last thing to be said is the future of that ideal. Where is the place for all of this in the society of American life, in this patchwork or tapestry of American religion? It's always there as a possibility. It is, one might say, a new chapter in this idea of monasticism, which had been offered in one way or another within the Christian community, certainly at least since the 3rd century, which had its own waxing and waning, both controlled by the church and out of control by the church. So here's a new chapter in monasticism in a way. And what happens as you look at the ideal is, you see here some of the basic questions which must be adequately answered in order for these sorts of communities to exist. The leadership and governance, obviously. You can have a founder figure, but you've also got to have a Joseph Meacham who's going to be the organizer and put it all together. You've got to have a distinctiveness, which means that it's not like, I don't believe you can establish a Methodist commune. Because, it's got to be distinctive enough so people say, well, that's different, let's see what that is. Well, you might, but I just don't know that. Membership, it has to cost something to join, not in material wealth, often that, but you have to give up some things in order to be a full-fledged member. You have to put both feet down within the community in order to make it work. The livelihood, the lifestyle for this idea has got to be viable. You can't starve people to death and keep them in your community. And the relationship to the larger society is something which is always an issue. The idea of whether it is utopian, that is to say, we want everybody to see this. If you see what we've got, you'll want to do it too. Or this introversionist thing which says, we are unto ourselves, we circle up the wagon, we're going to stay here and just be this body. Well now, most of these groups at last time are both. Shakers certainly were. They were utopian, then they were introversionists, then they became utopian again. So those things could be on a sliding scale. All these things have to do with what the future of this particular segment of American religious life is going to be like. So, see life. Now stop. you got comments, questions already?
John, we were thinking thinking about this, other people who have established something in the American religion, should we discount cults?
It depends on what happens to a cult. You know, I would discount Jim Jones,
Yeah.
because that really doesn't lead anywhere. Not enough Kool-Aid to make that work. But other groups are not going to be all that popular, but they will be distinctive from the next rest of American religion, or distinctive from the European background of American religion as it comes in. Sometimes it merges with some other kind of religious tradition, more recently it has. Sometimes it just has to do with a particular point of view about some doctrine, a dogma, that's really going to make a difference in this country. And it infuses the larger society in one way. Now, I've started with the easy one because this one is very much set apart from the rest of American society. You're either in one of these communities or you're not. That's a pretty definite line story. These other things I'm going to talk about are moods and impressionistic aspects of religious life which get a foothold in America in a special way. Sometimes in a way that doesn't get a foothold anywhere else, not always. Lacey, you got to say?
I was just going to say, how do you account for the persecution of Ann Lee, for instance, in our country, which was formed by these deists to open?
Well,
What happens?
you know, I don't think they were very protective of other people's religious beliefs. They just said, this is the way we have the country, kind of open, fair field, no favors again. But I think also it's a local thing. And if you are living close by somebody and you think either they're doing the wrong thing with regard to live together, I mean, you've got these people who are celibate, who are definitely celibate, men on one side, women on the other. There's no hanky-panky going on here. But if you get a community like this and people look in on it, one of the things that comes to mind is, what are they doing over there? And one of these other communities, which goes in exactly the other direction of the Oneida community, that John Humphrey Norris founded, and it was based on what they called complex marriage, but what everybody else called free love. So, you know, that's one of these questions which gets answered, and sometimes it causes a lot of problems, but it gets answered.
Yeah.
John, we are saying it, but did Ann Lee claim to be establishing a utopia?
Yeah, very much so.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Did Ann Lee think that she was establishing utopia? Yes. She was gathering this group together, and there was a defining line between those outside and those inside. It was going to be an entity unto itself. Now, she had no idea what it was going to look like. For her, it was individual to individual. I get you all, we're in the group. How are we going to organize? Not my problem. You know. So it's got to be routinized, or it's not going to last at all past the founder. It becomes then, Sterling, to use your word, it becomes a cult. It becomes the idea that one person is God's only conduit to us as a population. Nobody else can speak for him. And when that person is gone, we got nothing. So if you don't have some sort of second generation leadership, then this is true in these other groups that I'm going to talk about, which are quite different. Somebody's got to step up and say, hey, he had some good ideas, but let's see what we can do to make this thing last in the long run.
John, we're also assuming that Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Baptists, Lutherans, Anglicans are already here. They're not part of this established religions or being established.
That's an interesting thing. What happens, Sterling, is this thing I mentioned, denominations.
Mm-hmm.
What's going to happen is there are going to be a couple of handfuls, maybe a dozen, maybe you could add one or two others, of these organizations which emerge within, let's say, to some status within the first half of the 19th century, which rule the roost. And if you want to talk about religion in America, you're going to talk about the Baptists, the Methodists, the Episcopalians, Anglicans converted, Presbyterians, you're going to talk about Congregationalists, you're going to talk about Lutherans, you're going to talk about that whole group of churches of Christ, disciples of Christ, all that group that established on the frontier. But you can take in both hands, you can get the body of what American Protestant Christianity looks like. Of course, you got the Catholic tradition going on here, you got a little bit of Judaism going on, more as time passes, but there are not too many alternatives to those things, except for somebody who says, we're really going to do something different.
Okay.
Now, next Sunday, we're going to see somebody who says, we're really going to do something different. And we'll see how well that goes. Thank you all. Good luck.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.